For more than 150 years, the answer seemed obvious. Queen Victoria carried a bleeding disorder. She passed it to her children, they married into the royal houses of Europe, and princes began to die. Textbooks called it hemophilia. Case closed. Except it wasn't. Because no one had ever tested Victoria's blood, no one had sequenced her genes, and no one had identified which type of hemophilia haunted the most powerful bloodline on Earth. The real answer would remain locked inside a shallow grave in Russia, waiting for a technology that didn't exist yet. And when that answer finally came, it didn't just close a medical mystery. It revealed how a single invisible flaw in one woman's DNA helped bring down 3 empires and redrew the map of the 20th century. This is that story. Victoria was born in 1819 in Kensington Palace. Her father, Edward, Duke of Kent, was 51 years old. Her mother, a German princess, showed no signs of any bleeding disorder. No one in either family line had ever bled to death from a minor wound. There was no warning, no precedent. And for the first 34 years of Victoria's life, no evidence that anything was wrong at all. She married her cousin Prince Albert in 1840. Together, they had 9 children over 17 years, an enormous royal brood that would eventually earn Victoria a title more consequential than Queen of England. They called her the Grandmother of Europe. Through strategic marriages, her children and grandchildren would sit on thrones from London to Berlin to St. Petersburg to Madrid. It was a web of alliance built on bloodlines. And hidden inside those bloodlines, invisible and waiting, was a single mutation on the X chromosome, a tiny error in a gene called F9. The first sign appeared in 1853 with the birth of their 8th child, a boy named Leopold. He bruised easily. He bled longer than he should. Victoria wrote anxiously to relatives about his fragile health, his swollen knees, his terrible pain. Leopold was eventually diagnosed with hemophilia, a disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. Even small injuries could trigger hours, sometimes days, of uncontrolled bleeding. In an era when doctors treated wounds with lime and hydrogen peroxide, and the first experimental blood transfusion was still considered reckless, a diagnosis of hemophilia was something very close to a death sentence. Leopold survived longer than most. He attended Oxford. He married Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont. He fathered 2 children. By every outward measure, he had beaten the odds. Then, in March 1884, while wintering in Cannes, France, Leopold slipped on a staircase at the villa where he was staying and struck his knee and his head. The fall was minor, the kind any healthy person walks away from. The hemorrhage was not. Leopold died early the following morning of a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 30 years old. But Leopold was only the beginning. The cruel logic of the disease meant that Victoria's sons either had it or they didn't, and you would know quickly. But her daughters were the real danger. A woman could carry the mutation on one of her 2 X chromosomes and never bleed, never bruise, never suspect a thing. She could marry a prince, bear children, and discover only when a son began to bleed that she had been carrying the flaw all along. It was a disease that moved through women in silence and struck their sons without warning. Victoria's daughters became those silent carriers. At least 2 of them, Princess Alice and Princess Beatrice, carried the defective gene, and both married into continental royal families. This is where the story fractures into 3 separate bloodlines, 3 separate countries, and 3 very different catastrophes. Princess Alice married into the Grand Ducal family of Hesse in Germany. Her son Friedrich was diagnosed with hemophilia as an infant after a cut on his ear bled for 3 straight days. 3 months later, the toddler climbed onto a chair in his mother's bedroom, tipped forward, and fell through an open window. A healthy child might have survived the 20-foot drop. Friedrich, just 2 years old, died hours later from a brain hemorrhage. But Alice also had a daughter, Alex, who carried the gene forward. In 1894, Alex married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, changed her name to Alexandra, and became empress of the largest empire on earth. 10 years later, she gave birth to a son, Alexei, the sole male heir to the Romanov dynasty. Within days of his birth, his umbilical cord would not stop bleeding. Nicholas wrote in his diary that the infant lost roughly 1/8 of his total blood volume in 48 hours. The secret was kept from the Russian people, from the court, even from most of the family. Alexei's hemophilia became the most dangerous secret in the empire, because to admit the heir was fragile was to admit the dynasty was fragile. And Alexandra, desperate for any remedy, made a decision that would echo across the entire 20th century. She turned to Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a Siberian peasant mystic who claimed to possess the power of healing. And by accounts from doctors who witnessed it, his interventions, whatever they actually were, seemed to work. In 1912, during the family's worst crisis, 8-year-old Alexei suffered a massive internal hemorrhage while on holiday in Poland. His legs became paralyzed. He screamed in agony for days. Doctors prepared a death announcement. Last rites were administered. Then Alexandra's confidant sent a telegram to Rasputin, hundreds of miles away. His reply was calm. "The boy will not die. Do not let the doctors bother him too much." The next day, the bleeding stopped. Dr. Fedorov, one of Alexei's physicians, later admitted the recovery was completely inexplicable from a medical standpoint. From that moment, Rasputin's position was unassailable. Alexandra believed, with absolute conviction, that this man was the only thing standing between her son and death. And because Alexei's condition was secret, no one outside the innermost circle could understand why the Empress allowed a controversial, scandalous figure to influence appointments, policy, even wartime strategy. Historian Robert Massey has argued that caring for Alexei seriously diverted the attention of Nicholas from the business of war and government. Rasputin advised the Tsar to personally take command of the army during the First World War, a catastrophic decision for a man with no military experience. By 1916, members of the aristocracy were so alarmed by Rasputin's influence that a group of conspirators assassinated him. But the damage was done. Public trust in the monarchy had collapsed. Barely 2 months later, revolution swept Russia. Nicholas abdicated. And in July 1918, the Bolsheviks executed the entire family, Alexei included, in a basement in Yekaterinburg. He was 13 years old. Now, here is the gap that haunted researchers for the next 90 years. Everyone assumed the royal disease was hemophilia. But which form? Hemophilia A accounts for roughly 80% of all cases, caused by a defect in the F8 gene. Hemophilia B, far rarer, involves a different gene entirely, F9. Without molecular evidence, no one could say which gene Victoria carried. And it mattered, because understanding the exact mutation could reveal how it originated, how it spread, and whether it might still be lurking in living royal bloodlines. Before we see what the evidence finally revealed, if you're finding this story as gripping as we find it, subscribe so you don't miss future episodes where hidden science reshapes the history you thought you knew. The answer came from the same basement in Yekaterinburg. In 1991, a mass grave containing the remains of most of the Romanov family was discovered outside the city. But 2 bodies were missing, Alexei and one of his sisters. Then, in 2007, Russian archaeologists found a second shallow grave nearby, containing charred bone fragments. DNA analysis confirmed them, Alexei and his sister. Geneticist Evgeny Rogayev, working across institutions in Massachusetts and Moscow, saw an opportunity that no one in a century of speculation had possessed. Actual Romanov DNA. Bone fragments from the boy whose disease had helped topple an empire. Using multiplex target amplification and massively parallel sequencing. Techniques that simply did not exist when researchers first speculated about the royal disease, Rogaev's team began screening for mutations. First, they tested the F8 gene, the one responsible for hemophilia A. Nothing. No mutation. This alone was a surprise, since hemophilia A was the overwhelming favorite. Then they turned to F9. And there it was, a single mutation in the splice acceptor site of exon 4. The effect was precise and devastating. It created a premature stop codon, meaning the gene could only produce a truncated, non-functional version of clotting factor 9. This was hemophilia B, also known as Christmas disease, the rarer, severe form. The results, published in the journal Science in 2009, showed that Alexei was homozygous for the mutation, meaning his single X chromosome carried the defect with no backup copy. His mother Alexandra was a heterozygous carrier, as was one of his sisters, likely Anastasia. And because all of Victoria's affected descendants shared a common genetic heritage, the finding confirmed something far larger. Every case of royal hemophilia, in Russia, in Spain, in Germany, traced back to the same mutation, the same gene, in the same woman. Catherine High, a hematologist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, confirmed that the mutation matched established genetic patterns for hemophilia B. And Paul Monahan, a pediatric hematologist at the University of North Carolina, made a point that deserves to land hard. Hemophilia B, the rarer, less studied form, had now been shown to have had an enormous impact on Western history. The evidence didn't just close a medical case, it revealed how one flawed gene rewrote the fate of nations. Consider the full scope. In Russia, hemophilia brought Rasputin into the court, destabilized the monarchy, and contributed to a revolution that installed communism for 70 years. Historian Robert Massey posed the question bluntly. Had it not been for the agony of Alexei's hemophilia, had it not been for the desperation which drove Alexandra to Rasputin, might Russia have evolved into a constitutional monarchy? The path had been opening. The Duma had been created. Reform was underway. But Alexandra, guided by Rasputin, passionately resisted any sharing of imperial power. In Spain, Victoria Eugenie married King Alfonso XIII in 1906, despite explicit warnings that she might carry the gene. She did. Their eldest son, also named Alfonso, was diagnosed with hemophilia shortly after birth when his circumcision wound would not stop bleeding. Their youngest son, Gonzalo, was also affected. Alfonso XIII blamed his wife for contaminating the bloodline. The marriage collapsed. He took multiple mistresses and fathered illegitimate children. Both hemophiliac sons died young from internal bleeding after separate minor car accidents, Alfonso at 31 and Gonzalo at just 19. Political instability mounted. Alfonso fled Spain in 1931 when the Second Republic was declared. The vacuum eventually led to Francisco Franco's dictatorship, which endured until 1975. In Germany, Victoria's carrier granddaughters married into the Prussian and Hessian lines. Prince Waldemar of Prussia, born in 1889, was the last known hemophiliac among Victoria's descendants. He died in 1945, not from the disease itself, but because wartime chaos prevented a blood transfusion, with nearby medical resources diverted to survivors of Dachau. 3 bloodlines, 3 countries, 3 different forms of collapse, all traceable, through DNA, to a single molecular error in one woman's X chromosome. But the mystery has not fully closed. The origin of Victoria's mutation remains debated. The traditional explanation is a spontaneous mutation, a random error occurring either in Victoria herself or, more likely, in the sperm of her elderly father, who was 51 at her conception. Spontaneous mutations account for roughly 30% of all hemophilia cases, and mutation rates are known to increase significantly with paternal age. But researcher Luis Leguiater, working with living members of Victoria's extended family, has challenged this consensus. He argues Victoria likely inherited the gene rather than originating it, that earlier female carriers in her mother's German line went undetected because hemophilia can persist for generations without symptoms if it passes only through daughters. If he is right, the commonly cited 30% spontaneous mutation rate for hemophilia may be inflated by incomplete family histories. Boys in Victoria's maternal line did die young, but their deaths were never connected to a bleeding disorder. The question could theoretically be settled with a DNA test of Victoria's own remains, but the royal family has never sanctioned such a study. And so the earliest chapter of this story remains unwritten. What is written, in the bones pulled from that Russian grave, is something no Victorian-era physician could have imagined. A substitution in one coding site, in one gene, on one chromosome, passed silently through daughters and violently through sons, across 4 countries and 5 generations, reshaping empires along the way. Today, the hemophilia gene appears to have vanished from European royalty. The current British line descends through Edward VII, a son of Victoria who did not carry the mutation. The Spanish monarchy was restored under Juan Carlos, grandson of Alfonso XIII, through a branch untouched by the disease. The Romanovs are gone entirely. If this hidden thread of history fascinated you, subscribe to follow more stories where science illuminates what history could only guess at. Prince Waldemar of Prussia died in 1945. He was the last. A single mutation, born in the early 1800s, burned through the most powerful families on Earth for just over a century, then disappeared. It toppled a Tsar, fractured a king, and left behind a question that geneticists are still turning over. If Victoria's father had been younger, if that one nucleotide had copied correctly, if that single error in F9 had simply never happened, would the Russian Revolution have unfolded the way it did? Would Franco have ever risen to power in Spain? One mutation, 3 empires, and a century of consequences no one saw coming, hidden in the blood.